Under the burning skies of the New Mexico territory, the land stretched wide and wild a place, where silence carried secrets, and every wind gust told stories older than men. Dust swirled along the ridges, brushing over the graves of those who tried to tame what could never be owned. It was in that land half-desert, half-dreamed, that the rancher's daughter lived, her heart bound to fences and fears. Until the night she met the Apache warrior, her father's ranch stood like a lonely fortress at the edge of the canyon. Cattle grazed in the dying light, and the men rode with rifles always near. Trouble had been brewing for weeks. Raids, missing horses, whispers of revenge. Folks in town said the Apache had returned to claim what was once theirs. To her, they were stories told around campfires. Until that night, one of them walked right out of the darkness and into her world. She had gone to fetch water, the moon breaking through the clouds, her lantern swaying in the wind. The creek was quiet except for the splash of her pail. But then she felt it a presence. Before she could turn, a shadow stepped from the trees. Her breath caught as the figure came closer, tall and silent, eyes like burning amber beneath his hair. The firelight revealed an Apache warrior, his body marked by tribal paint and the weight of battles fought long before her birth. He didn't raise his weapon. Instead, he spoke softly, his voice deep as the canyon itself. "You shouldn't be here alone." Something in his tone, half warning, half wonder, made her forget to be afraid. She looked at him, trying to see the savage her father had described, but all she saw was strength shaped by the earth itself. His muscles glistened in the faint light, every line carved by hardship. He seemed more spirit than man, as though the desert had chosen him. "What do you want?" she asked, gripping the pail like a shield. He stepped closer, each stride slow, deliberate. "To speak," he said. "To tell you why your father's men should leave our valley?" His English was rough, but his meaning clear. Her father had built his fortune where the Apache once hunted. Now both sides were ready for war. Yet in that moment, she didn't feel like a soldier's daughter or an enemy. She felt only the pull of something she couldn't name, something that made her heart quicken and her fear melt into curiosity. They stood facing each other, the air heavy with tension. The lantern light flickered, dancing across his skin. She could smell the smoke from his camp, the faint trace of sage and wild earth clinging to him. It wasn't the smell of danger, it was freedom. Before she could speak again, shouts echoed from the ranch. Men were coming. The Apache turned toward the sound, his jaw tightening. He knew what would happen if they saw him there. "Go," she whispered. "They'll shoot you." He hesitated, eyes locked on hers. "And you? Will you tell them you saw me?" She shook her head, but before he left, he took a step closer, so close she could feel his breath, smell the desert wind on his skin. "You'll have to endure every part of me," he whispered, his voice low like a vow. Then he vanished into the night. She didn't sleep that night. His words replayed in her mind until dawn broke over the hills. There was something haunting in his tone, something that felt less like a threat and more like a promise. The next day, when her father rode into town to speak with the sheriff, she wandered to the edge of the canyon where the land dipped into shadow. She found footprints there bare, strong Apache prints. She touched one with her hand, wondering if he'd been watching from the ridges. Over the next few days, the tension in the valley grew. Horses were taken, cattle lost. The ranch hands whispered that the Apache were circling again. Her father cursed the savages and sent riders to scout the borders. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the warrior she met wasn't part of those raids. Something in his eyes had told her he didn't come for blood. He came for something else, something she couldn't yet understand. Then one evening, as the sky bled red over the canyon, she saw him again. He was standing at the far fence line, motionless as stone. She froze. He didn't move until she stepped closer, her heart hammering. "You shouldn't have come back," she said softly. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that held both sorrow and defiance. "You still draw water from our stream?" he replied. "I came to see if the earth still remembers us." There was no anger in his voice, only a quiet ache. She wanted to speak, to ask his name, but before she could, the sound of hoofbeats tore through the air. 2 ranch hands rode in fast, shouting, The Apache's eyes flared with warning. In one swift motion, he grabbed her wrist and pulled her into the brush. They crouched low as the riders passed by, their rifles glinting in the sun. She could feel his heart beat against her arm, steady as a drum. When the riders were gone, he didn't let go. "You don't belong to them," he murmured. "You look at this land the way we once did." His words cut through her like a windstorm. She wanted to deny it, but deep down she knew he was right. She loved the land not for profit or fences, but for its wildness. And in him she saw that same wild spirit. As the days went by, she began to find signs of him and Arrow, left by the creek. A feather near the barn, a whisper in the wind that felt like his voice. Each sign drew her closer to the edge of something forbidden. One night, a storm rolled across the desert. Rain hit the roofs like stones. She couldn't sleep, so she went to the barn to check the horses. Lightning flashed, and there he was again, standing in the shadows. He had been wounded. Blood ran down his arm. Instinct overrode fear. She tore a piece of her dress and wrapped his arm, trembling as her fingers brushed his skin. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. He met her eyes, rain dripping from his hair. "And yet you still help me." Something in the way he said it made her forget the world outside. The distance between them vanished. For a heartbeat, they stood in silence, the thunder rolling over the valley. Then he leaned closer, his voice a whisper barely louder than the rain. "You'll have to endure every part of me," he said again. The same words as before, but this time they carried a weight she couldn't escape. Before she could answer, hoofbeats thundered again, men shouting her name, rifles raised. The Apache turned toward the door, eyes dark with resolve. "If they find you, they'll kill you," she said. Grabbing his hand, "Then I'll make sure they find nothing left but the storm," he replied. The barn door rattled. Voices grew louder. She looked at him, torn between loyalty and something deeper. Something she couldn't name. The thunder cracked again. As the door swung open and the light of a dozen lanterns flooded in, that was the moment everything changed. The barn filled with light as the men burst through the doors, their boots pounding the wooden floor. The ranch hands carried lanterns and rifles, shouting her name. She froze, heart hammering, as the Apache slipped silently behind a stack of hay bales, moving like a shadow. She prayed they wouldn't notice the drops of water on the floor or the trail of blood leading into the dark. One of the men, her father's foreman, raised his lantern higher. His eyes narrowed. "You shouldn't be out here, miss," he said, glancing around. "There's talk that the Apache have been moving through the hills again." She nodded, forcing a calm breath, though her pulse was racing. "I thought I heard the horses kicking the stall," she replied softly. "I came to check." Studied her for a moment, suspicious but tired. "Get back inside," he said finally. "Your father's on his way home, and he'll raise hell if he finds you in this storm." She promised she would, and watched as they left, their lanterns fading into the rain. When the barn was quiet again, she turned toward the shadows. The Apache was gone. She found the back door slightly open, the storm raging outside. For a long while she stood there, staring into the darkness. Part of her wanted to believe he had vanished for good, that she would never see him again, that life would return to the way it was before. But deep down, she knew better. Something had changed that night, something she couldn't undo. The next morning, the valley looked washed clean by rain, yet beneath that calm lay unease. Her father returned from town with a scowl that could cut stone. He gathered the men in the yard, his voice sharp as a whip. 3 horses stolen, 2 fences cut, and signs of fires near the ridge, he said. "This means war." She stood on the porch, clutching the railing, watching as the men loaded rifles and saddlebags. Every word he spoke drove her heart deeper into conflict. She wanted to tell him, not all Apache sought blood, that one had come not to fight, but to speak, to warn. But how could she? No one would believe her. They would call her foolish, or worse, a traitor to her own people. The sun rose high as her father rode out with his men, their horses kicking dust into the pale sky. The sound faded slowly, leaving the ranch in uneasy silence. The day dragged on, heavy with heat and dread. She tried to distract herself by tending to the animals, mending torn clothes, anything to quiet her mind. But her thoughts kept drifting to the man in the barn, the look in his eyes, the way he spoke of the land as if it were alive. She remembered his words, "You don't belong to them." It was strange how those few words unsettled her more than her father's threats of war. That night, unable to rest, she walked out toward the canyon. The moon hung low, painting silver over the cliffs. She stopped near the stream where she had first seen him. For a moment she thought she was alone. Then she saw him, standing by the water, his body outlined by moonlight. He had changed out of his torn leathers and now wore a cloak made of woven hide. His arm was still bandaged from where she had wrapped it. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice trembling despite herself. He turned, the faintest smile crossing his lips. "Neither should you. You could have been killed," she whispered. "They're hunting your kind. My father is leading them." He stepped closer, slow and steady, the night air thick between them. "Your father believes the land is his. But this place remembers before his fences, before his walls. My people lived where your cattle graze. We buried our dead where your barn stands." His words carried both sorrow and pride. She wanted to look away, but something in his gaze held her still. "I didn't choose where I was born," she said quietly. He nodded. "Nor did I, but we both must carry what others left us." He paused, glancing toward the horizon. "Your father's men killed a boy last winter. Only 16. My brother. He was gathering wood for the fire." Her chest tightened. "I didn't know," she said, her voice breaking. "I swear I didn't." "I know," he said. "That's why I came. Not for revenge, but for warning. There are others who don't want peace. They're tired of being ghosts in their own land." The wind howled through the canyon, and for a long moment neither spoke. She saw something in his eyes, a burden she could feel, even if she couldn't name. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated before answering. "Tayon," he said softly. "It means strong heart." "Tayon," she repeated, the name strange and beautiful on her tongue. "I don't know what will happen when my father returns." "War will come," he said simply. "It always does when men refuse to listen." She wanted to believe there was another way, that reason or compassion could stop what was coming. But the more she thought about her father's rage, the less hope she felt. "If they find you, they'll hang you," she said. He smiled faintly, eyes glinting in the moonlight. "Then I'll stand tall until the rope tightens." The courage in his words frightened her as much as it moved her. He didn't speak like the men she knew. He carried his pain with dignity, not bitterness. The night seemed to close in around them. And for a moment, she wished time would stop right there before morning came, before blood spilled. Before she had to choose between family and conscience. When she finally returned to the ranch, she found her father waiting on the porch, his face drawn and dusty. "Where were you?" he demanded. "I went to check the stream," she said quickly. He studied her, suspicion flaring. "You stay away from that canyon," he growled. "There's nothing out there but death." She nodded, though her throat ached with unspoken truth. The following days passed, like the slow tightening of her rope. The ranch hands patrolled night and day. Smoke signals rose from the distant hills. Every sound in the dark made her heart jump. Then one evening, as the sun sank behind the mesas, a wounded rider stumbled into the yard. His horse was bleeding, his clothes torn. He gasped for water, whispering through cracked lips. "They ambushed us near the ridge. 10 men down." Her father's face turned pale. He barked orders, and soon the yard was alive with chaos. Men saddled horses, rifles clattered, and someone shouted that they saw torches on the far hill. She watched helplessly from the porch as her father mounted his horse. "Lock the doors," he told her. "If we don't come back by sunrise, ride east." Then they rode into the night, leaving her alone with the sound of distant thunder that might have been gunfire. Hours passed, then silence. She couldn't stand waiting any longer. She lit a lantern and stepped out into the wind. The sky had darkened again, clouds hiding the stars. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a faint glow flickered, the sign of a campfire. She followed the trail through the sagebrush. heart pounding, until she reached a clearing. There, through the shifting light of the flames, she saw figures moving. Some were Apache, some were not. A group of men lay on the ground, wounded and bound. Among them, she recognized one of her father's riders. He was alive, but barely. Then she saw him standing apart from the others, his face hard, his jaw clenched. He held no weapon, but the others looked to him as if he did. When he saw her, his expression changed from steel to disbelief. "You shouldn't have come," he said under his breath. She stepped closer, trembling. "Where is my father?" "He's alive," he said after a pause. "But he's in their hands now. They want to trade him for our land back." Her breath caught. "And you?" "I told them no blood should be spilled tonight," he said quietly. "But they don't listen to me anymore." A shout cut through the night. One of the Apache elders, older than the hills themselves, pointed toward her. "She's the rancher's daughter," he said. "She should share her father's fate." Tayon moved between them, his voice rising. "No, she's under my word." The old man's eyes burned. "Then her life is tied to yours." The wind picked up, whipping the fire into sparks. She looked at Tayon, her pulse thundering. "What does that mean?" she whispered. He turned to her, his voice low and solemn. "It means, if I fall before dawn, they will not spare you either." The fire crackled. The night closed in tighter. Somewhere in the distance, a lone coyote howled, and she realized that the storm she had feared from the start had finally arrived, and there was no turning back now. The night grew heavier as the wind howled through the canyon, carrying the sound of drums from deep within the Apache camp. Sparks leaped from the fire, rising into the black sky before vanishing into the dark. The rancher's daughter stood frozen near the edge of the clearing, her heart pounding as the men around her argued in a language she barely understood. Faces painted with ash and red clay glowed in the firelight, eyes sharp with fury and grief. Across from her, Tayon stood firm, his voice low but commanding as he tried to reason with them. She didn't know what he said. It's only that his words carried the weight of both loyalty and defiance. When the old chief raised his hand, the noise faded. His face was a map of years and battles. He pointed toward her, his gaze filled with the bitterness of a man who had lost too much. "Your father took our land," he said in rough English. "Now the land will take something from him." She wanted to answer, to plead, but no words came. Her throat was dry, her voice gone. Tayon stepped closer to the chief, speaking softly but firmly, his tone calm yet urgent. The firelight flickered over his face, revealing a scar that ran along his jaw mark of another battle, another life. "You protect her too much," the old man growled at him. "You forget what they did to your brother." Tayon's eyes darkened, but his voice remained steady. "I remember everything," he said. "That is why I won't let blood blind me again." The chief turned away, muttering to the others. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke. The girl's gaze drifted to the shadows where her father was tied near a wagon. His head bowed, his face pale in the firelight. He looked older than she'd ever seen him, his hands trembling against the ropes. She wanted to run to him, but one of the guards stepped forward, blocking her path. Tayon caught her glance and gave a slight shake of his head. "Not yet," he whispered. "Let them calm first." Hours passed, the fire dying to embers. The Apache began to settle into uneasy silence, though the guards never lowered their weapons. She sat near a fallen log, the cold biting through her dress. Her eyes fixed on Tayon. He moved like a man burdened by two worlds. One he couldn't abandon, and another he couldn't fully hate. Every time he looked at her, she saw the weight of that struggle written across his face. When dawn began to rise, pale light creeping over the cliffs, Tayon walked to where her father lay bound. The older man stirred, opening his eyes with a grimace. "You think tying me up will fix anything?" he spat. "You'll just start another war you can't win." Tayon knelt beside him, quiet for a moment before replying. "War already began the moment your fences cut through our burial ground. I could have come to talk," her father said bitterly. "But you chose to steal and kill instead." "And your men shot first," Tayon answered. "We only took what you never returned." Their voices carried the kind of anger that came from generations, not just men. The daughter listened, every word cutting deeper. She realized neither side truly wanted peace. They were too far gone for that. What held them apart wasn't just land, but pride, as the sun climbed higher. She saw movement in the distant dust, rising from the far ridge. A group of riders approached, armed and fast. Her heart skipped. "My father's men," she whispered. Tot turned sharply. The Apache guards shouted warnings, grabbing their rifles and bows. The camp burst into chaos. Within minutes, both sides were taking positions. The line between defense and attack fading into the heat. Taeon looked back at her. "You need to stay low," she said. "If they see me, they'll shoot you too." He stared at her, frustration and something softer flickering in his eyes. "You think you can stop this?" "I can try," she said, her voice trembling but determined. The riders reached the edge of the clearing. Her father's foreman, the same man who had warned her in the barn, called out, "Release the boss and step away, or we'll burn this camp to the ground." Taeon shouted something in his native tongue, and arrows flew. Gunfire erupted in response, echoing through the canyon like thunder. She dropped to the ground, covering her ears as the sound of bullets tore through the air. Horses screamed, men shouted, and smoke filled the valley. The old chief fell beside the fire, struck in the shoulder. The smell of gunpowder mixed with burning wood. Through the chaos, she saw Taeon pulling her father behind a wagon for cover. She crawled toward them, heart racing, feeling the dirt scrape her knees. "We have to stop them," she said, gasping. Tan fired once into the air and shouted in both English and Apache. The shooting slowed, then stopped, but the silence that followed was worse than the gunfire. The two sides faced each other, weapons still raised, eyes burning with hate. The girl stood, her voice cracking as she shouted, "Stop it!" Enough. Every head turned toward her. She stood between them, trembling, her dress stained with dust and blood. "This land is killing all of you," she said. "You fight and bury your sons, and still no one wins." Her father tried to rise but couldn't. "Come back here," he rasped. "You don't know what you're saying?" "I do," she said, looking at him with tears in her eyes. "I've seen what hate looks like now." The Apache listened in silence, their faces unreadable. Taeon lowered his rifle but kept his eyes on the men across the clearing. "She's right," he said quietly. "This war won't end with victory. It'll end when none of us are left standing." For a brief moment, no one moved. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, the riders began to back away, dragging their wounded. Her father's foreman shouted orders, and soon they disappeared into the rising dust. Leaving behind only the echo of gunfire, the camp fell still. Smoke drifted upward in thin spirals. The old chief groaned as two young men carried him toward a tent. The air smelled of burned sage and blood. She looked at Taeon, who was helping her father stand. "Why did you protect him?" she asked quietly. Taeon's gaze met hers. "Because I'm tired of burying brothers," he said. Her father leaned against the wagon, staring at him with weary eyes. "You've got the heart of a fool," he muttered. "They'll turn on you for helping me." "Maybe," Taeon said. "But at least I'll know I did what was right." That night, they stayed in the camp under a fragile truce. The Apache buried their dead beneath the junipers. Her father sat silently by the fire, his hands shaking from exhaustion and shame. The daughter watched Taeon speak quietly with the surviving warriors. His presence was strong, his voice steady, yet there was a heaviness in him, like a man standing between two storms. Later, when the others slept, she walked to the edge of the camp where the moonlight touched the river. Taeon joined her, his face pale in the silver glow. "They'll come again," he said softly. "Your people, mine. Peace never lasts long here. Then why fight for it?" she asked. He looked out over the water, his expression distant. "Because even if it lasts only a moment, it's still worth fighting for." She wanted to tell him she understood, but words felt too small. Instead, she reached out and touched his arm gently. The wind carried the scent of cedar and smoke between them. For a heartbeat, it felt like the world had stopped turning. Behind them, sudden noise broke the calm shouting. Horses, the crack of a gunshot. The night exploded once again. Someone had fired from the ridge and chaos returned like a flood. Taeon pulled her down, covering her with his body as bullets tore through the camp. Flames caught in the tents, men shouted orders, and the fragile truce shattered. She looked up at him, eyes wide with terror. They came back. He didn't answer. His jaw tightened, and his hand found hers. "Stay with me," he said. "No matter what happens." The firelight flickered across his face as he turned toward the fight. She clung to his arm, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything forever. The sound of the river mixed with gunfire. The sky turned red with smoke, and in that storm of violence and love, neither side could see where vengeance ended and survival began. The gunfire tore through. The stillness of the night like a wild storm. Sparks burst from rifles. Arrows hissed through the air, and the cries of men and horses filled the valley. The Apache camp that had moments ago glowed with the piece of firelight was now swallowed by chaos. Smoke rose from burning tents, and the scent of gunpowder clung to the wind. The rancher's daughter clung to Taeon's arm, her breath ragged, her ears ringing from the sound of shots echoing across the canyon. He pulled her toward the rocks, his hand tight around hers, guiding her through the dark as bullets struck the ground around them. They came from the ridge. Taeon shouted over the noise. They waited for the night to fall again. His face was fierce, streaked with ash and blood. He pushed her behind a fallen log and crouched in front of her, scanning the shadows. "Stay here," he ordered. "If they reach the camp, run toward the river. Follow the water until you find cover." "No," she said, gripping his wrist. "You'll be killed out there." His gaze softened for a brief moment, but the fire in his eyes didn't fade. "If I die, they'll burn everything my people have left. I can't let that happen." He pulled his hand free, then vanished into the smoke. She could hear the crack of his rifle moments later, each shot measured, each echo cutting through the chaos. The camp was now a blur of movement. Warriors darted between tents, returning fire at shadows moving along the ridge. The flames painted the scene in a cruel light, turning faces into ghosts. The old chief's tent was burning, his warriors struggling to drag him away. She ran to help, ignoring the fear pounding in her chest. Together, they pulled him toward the riverbank, the old man gasping in pain but refusing to fall. His eyes, though dim with age, burned with defiance. "The white men won't stop," he rasped. "They never stop until the land bleeds dry." She knelt beside him, her hands shaking. "Please, let me help," she said, tearing a strip of her dress to wrap his shoulder. The old man looked at her with something between anger and pity. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "You'll be buried between two worlds, and neither will claim you." Before she could answer, a gunshot struck the ground inches from her feet. She froze. Then she saw him, her father's foreman, standing at the edge of the flames, rifle raised. His face was streaked with dirt, his hat gone, his eyes wild. "Step away from him," he shouted. "You're coming with me, miss? The boss is hurt. We're getting out of here." She didn't move. "Where's my father?" she cried. "He's alive," the foreman yelled back. "But if you stay with them, you won't be." Behind him, Taeon appeared like a shadow from the smoke, moving silently across the rocks. The foreman didn't see him until it was too late. In one swift motion, Taeon knocked the rifle aside and shoved the man to the ground. The two struggled, rolling through the dirt. The rifle went off, the sound deafening. She screamed, but neither man stopped. The fight was brutal, no words, no mercy. Finally, Taeon struck the foreman across the face, sending him sprawling into the dust. The man didn't move again. Taeon turned toward her, breathing hard, blood dripping from a cut on his brow. "You shouldn't have come out," he said. "You left me," she replied, her voice breaking. "I couldn't just hide while everyone was dying." He looked at her for a long moment, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of battle and exhaustion. "Then stay close," he said finally. "If this ends tonight, I want you to live to see another sunrise." The sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed through the canyon. Taeon grabbed her hand again, pulling her behind a row of rocks. From the ridge, The remaining riders of her father's men were descending, their torches like stars of fire. Behind them, the Apache regrouped, forming a line across the valley floor. The two forces faced each other again, the distance between them shrinking by the second. The air went still, heavy with the weight of what was coming. The only sound was the crackle of fire and the faint rush of the river. Taeon raised his rifle but didn't fire. He looked across the field at the men who had taken so much from his people and, yet his hand trembled. "They'll keep coming until every one of us is gone," he said quietly. She turned to him, her eyes wet. "Then let me speak to them, please. They'll listen to me." "They won't," he said, shaking his head. "You're the daughter of the man who started this war. They'll see you as a weapon, not a voice." "Then I'll make them see," she whispered. Before he could stop her, she rose from behind the rocks and stepped into the open. Her pale dress caught the light of the flames, glowing like a ghost in the smoke. The gunfire paused for a breath, both sides startled by the sight of her walking alone between them. She raised her hands and shouted, "Stop! Please, no more." Her voice carried across the canyon, trembling but strong. "You're killing each other for land that doesn't belong to anyone. It's the Earth's, not yours, not ours. You fight and you die, and nothing changes." The riders hesitated. Taeon stepped out behind her, his rifle lowered, his presence commanding. "She speaks the truth," he called. "You think victory will give you peace. But peace doesn't come from killing what you fear." One of the riders, her father, emerged from the shadows, leaning heavily on his horse. His clothes were torn, his face lined with pain, but his eyes were sharp as ever. "You've lost your mind, girl," he said. "Get away from him." "I won't," she said, her voice steady. "I can't let this go on." Her father's gaze hardened. "That man standing beside you murdered our men?" Taehan took a step forward. "I buried more brothers than you can count," he said. "But I never killed for greed." The old chief, still standing despite his wound, raised his hand toward the sky. "The sun rises for no man's side," he said. "Yet here you all are, trying to burn the world before it shines again." A low rumble of thunder rolled over the canyon. The wind picked up, whipping the smoke into swirls. Horses whinnied, men shouted, and the fragile silence broke again. A gun fired. No one knew who pulled the trigger first, but it was enough. The battle reignited Data and grabbed her and pulled her down as chaos erupted once more. Her father's men charged from the ridge, firing into the camp. The Apache answered with arrows and rifles, the air thick with smoke and fury. She could feel the ground trembling under the horses' hooves, smell the acrid sting of burning powder. Taeon pushed her behind a wagon, shouting orders to the warriors nearby. He fired at the riders, then ducked as a bullet struck the wheel beside his head. "They'll surround us soon," he said. "We can't stay here." She looked around desperately. "The river," she said. "We can reach the other side before they close in." He nodded once. "Stay behind me." They moved quickly, keeping low as they ran through the chaos. The sounds of war followed them, men screaming, fires crackling, the sharp cry of a wounded horse. When they reached the riverbank, the current was stronger than before, swollen by the recent rain. Taeon waded in first, holding out his hand to her. "It's deep," he warned. "Don't let go." She took his hand, the cold water rushing around them. Behind them, the battle raged on, flashes of light cutting through the smoke. When they reached the center, a shout rang out. Her father stood on the bank, rifle in hand, his face pale and furious. "Let her go," he yelled. "She's not one of you." Taeon turned slowly, water up to his waist. "You don't own her," he said, his voice carrying over the roar of the river. "No one does." Her father raised his rifle, his hands trembling. She saw the pain in his eyes, the confusion of a man watching the world he built crumble around him. "If you take one more step," he said, "I'll shoot." The rain began to fall again, soft at first, then harder, washing the blood from the ground. The sky flashed with lightning, thunder shaking the canyon walls. The Apache warrior stood tall in the river, his grip tight on her hand, his eyes locked on the man across from him. The distance between them seemed smaller than ever, yet filled with everything they had, both lost, family, land, peace, faith. Her father's finger tightened on the trigger, and in that suspended heartbeat, time seemed to stop. She screamed his name, the storm roaring around them. And the next sound that followed was drowned by thunder. The gunshot cracked through the storm, like a final cry from the dying land. The sound echoed between the canyon walls and then was swallowed by the rain. For a moment no one moved. The world stood still, as if even the wind dared not breathe. The rancher's daughter clutched Taeyeon's arm, waiting for pain, waiting for the end, but it didn't come. When she looked up, her father's rifle had fallen from his trembling hands. The old man stood at the riverbank, staring at the weapon lying in the mud. His face pale, his eyes wide with something that looked less like anger and more like regret. His hands shook as he whispered, "I can't do it. Not anymore." Taeyeon's body trembled with tension, his grip still firm around her. Slowly, he lowered his rifle and took a step back toward the shore. "Then let it end here," he said softly, his voice carrying over the rain. "No more fighting. No more graves." The river rushed between them, washing away the tracks of everything that had happened that night. The thunder began to fade, the wind softened, and the sound of hooves and gunfire grew distant. The remaining riders had fled. The Apache warriors, too, began to lower their weapons, watching as the storm carried away the smoke and dust. The battle that had filled the valley had burned itself out, leaving only silence and rain. The rancher sank to his knees by the riverbank. His hat floated away in the current, his face wet with more than just rain. He looked at his daughter standing beside the man he had once called an enemy. "You could have died," he said weakly. She moved closer, her heart aching. "So could you," she whispered. "But if we keep living like this, we'll all die someday anyway, just slower." Her father didn't answer. He stared at the ground, the weight of years pressing down on him. Behind him, one of his men appeared out of the smoke leading a wounded horse. The foreman's face was bloodied but alive. "It's over," he said. "They've scattered. We've lost half the herd and most of our men." The old man nodded without looking up. "Then it's done," he murmured. "The land can take what's left." Taeyeon crossed the last stretch of river and stood before him. His presence was quiet but unyielding, his voice calm. "We won't harm what remains of your people. The valley will rest for a time." Her father lifted his gaze slowly, studying the Apache warrior in front of him. The hatred that once burned in his eyes was gone, replaced by exhaustion and something he hadn't felt in years: respect. "You're not like the rest of them," he said. Taeyeon's jaw tightened. "I'm exactly like them," he replied. "Just tired of burying my past." The rancher nodded slowly, understanding what words couldn't express. He stood, leaning heavily on his rifle like a cane, and turned toward his daughter. "If you stay, you'll have no home left to return to," he said. "I know," she answered quietly, "but maybe it's time I build one of my own." There was no argument left in him. He looked at her one last time, his face lined with pain and pride, then walked toward the ridge with his men. The sound of their horses faded into the mist until there was nothing left but the whisper of the rain and the rushing river. For a long while, neither she nor Taeyeon spoke. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and smoke. When he finally looked at her, his eyes were soft but wary. "You've lost your world," he said quietly. She shook her head. "Maybe I've found where I belong." The Apache camp was in ruins by the time they returned. Tents had collapsed, fires had gone cold, and the wounded lay under blankets of woven hide. The old chief still lived, though barely. He called for Taeyeon, his voice thin as paper. "Did it end?" he asked. Tata knelt beside him. "Yes, the fighting's done." The old man closed his eyes, breathing a long, rattling breath. "Then the spirits can rest again." His hand found Taeyeon's, and then hers. "The land will choose who stays and who fades," he said softly. "But remember, peace isn't something you inherit. It's something you earn every sunrise." When he passed, they buried him by the river under a cedar tree. The rain had stopped by then, and the first light of dawn stretched over the valley. The sky glowed gold and pink, as if the earth itself was trying to start over. The rancher's daughter stood beside Taeyeon as the last stones were laid. Feeling a quiet she had never known before, days turned into weeks. The wounded healed slowly. The survivors rebuilt what they could. The ranch to the north stayed empty, its fences broken, its cattle scattered across the plains. Her father never returned to claim it. Word spread that he'd left the territory, heading east to start over somewhere far from war and desert dust. She stayed in the valley, working alongside Taeon's people. The first time she helped gather water from the creek, one of the women handed her a small carved charm. For strength, the woman said, "You'll need it." At night, she sat outside the tents, listening to the sounds of the desert, the distant cry of an owl, the crackle of the fire, the low murmur of men singing to the stars. Taeon often joined her, sitting quietly, his face calm but his eyes always searching the horizon. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, she asked him, "Do you think your people will forgive mine someday?" He thought for a long moment before answering. Forgiveness isn't a gift you wait for. It's a seed you plant and hope it grows. He glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Maybe we've already started." They grew closer in the quiet that followed. The distance that once divided them began to fade, not because the world around them had changed, but because they had. She learned the rhythms of his language, the stories his tribe told of the stars, the way they thanked the earth for each breath. He learned the ways of her people, too, how to mend fences, how to tame horses, how to laugh without sorrow trailing behind. Still, not all wounds healed easily. There were nights when gunfire echoed faintly from beyond the hills, reminders that peace was fragile. Sometimes she would wake to find Taeon standing alone by the river, staring toward the horizon as if expecting ghosts. When she joined him, he would simply take her hand without a word, and together they would watch the sunrise wash over the land that had taken so much and given just as much back. Seasons passed. The valley bloomed again after the long rains. Wildflowers covered the ground where blood had once spilled. Travelers passing through spoke of a strange calm in that place, as if the earth itself refused to let violence take root again. The locals began calling it Whispering River, because on quiet nights the water seemed to murmur like voices. Some said they were the spirits of the fallen. Others said they were prayers carried by the wind in the end. She built a small cabin near the river, not far from the old burial tree. It stood on the line between what was once her father's land and what belonged to the Apache. Taeon helped her raise the walls, each plank a symbol of something new. When it was finished, they stood in the doorway, the wind playing with her hair, the scent of cedar filling the air. "This place," she said softly, "it doesn't belong to either of us. But maybe it will let us belong to it." As Taeon smiled faintly. "The land doesn't take sides," he said. "It only remembers who listened." Years later, people who rode through that valley spoke of a woman and an Apache man who lived quietly by the river. They said the rancher's daughter never left, that she and the warrior tended the earth together and raised children who spoke 2 languages and carried no hate in their hearts. Some said the land healed because of them. Others said it was just time's way of mending what men had broken. The truth didn't matter much anymore. What mattered was that the valley was alive again, the water clear, the soil rich, the air free of gunfire. The rancher's fences had rotted away, and in their place, wild grass grew tall under the open sky. The people who passed through called it a land of peace, but to her, it was simply home. On quiet evenings, when the sun dipped low and the river shimmered with gold, she would sit beside Taeon and listen to the wind move through the canyon. It carried the faintest echo of that first night by the creek, when fear and wonder had crossed paths and changed everything. And in that sound she would hear his voice again, low, steady, eternal. "You'll have to endure every part of me," he had whispered once. And she had. Through war, loss, and the slow rebuilding of a world that refused to die, she had endured. And in that endurance, she found not just him but herself. The valley slept peacefully that night, under a sky scattered with stars, and for the first time in many years, the land finally felt whole again.